What if your greatest weapon isn't your strength, but your prayer? Could the fiercest battles in your life be God's invitation to deeper trust? Ever wonder what happens in the unseen when a woman refuses to stop praying? Ladies and gentlemen, have you ever felt like the odds were stacked against you? Have you faced battles so fierce that you thought you wouldn't survive? Maybe it's a struggle in your home, a crisis in your health, or a storm raging in your soul. The world may tell you to fight with your strength, but I am here to tell you today you don't have to fight alone, because when a woman prays, truly prays, heaven moves, demons tremble, and God himself rises as to fight on her behalf. There is a power in the prayer of a woman that the enemy cannot withstand, and today I want to tell you why God fights for the woman who prays. A praying woman is a force to be reckoned with. She may not always be seen, but the effects of her prayers are felt in ways that shake the very foundations of the world around her. She does not fight her battles with weapons of this earth, nor does she rely on human strength. Instead, she lifts her voice to heaven, and the God who spoke the universe into existence moves on her behalf. Throughout history, women have changed the course of families, communities, and nations, not through power, but through prayer. A woman who prays understands that her strength is not in her hands, but in the one who holds all things together. When she prays, she invites the presence of God into her circumstances. She does not merely hope for change, she believes for it, she contends for it, and she refuses to give up until heaven responds. The world may dismiss the power of a praying woman, but Scripture tells a different story. Hannah was barren, mocked, and desperate. She could have accepted her situation, but instead she prayed. She wept before the Lord, pouring out her heart with a faith that would not be denied. And what happened? God opened her womb, and the child she bore, Samuel, became one of the greatest prophets in history. Esther was just a young woman in a foreign land, seemingly powerless against the mighty Persian Empire. But when a decree threatened to wipe out her people, she turned to fasting and prayer. She did not run to the king first, she ran to God, and because she prayed, the heart of the king was changed, the enemy was defeated, and an entire nation was saved. The Syrophoenician woman in the New Testament had a daughter tormented by demons. She was not from Israel, and by cultural standards, she had no right to ask anything of Jesus, but she refused to be silent. She prayed with persistence, and even when it seemed like she was being ignored, she pressed on. Jesus marveled at her faith and granted her request. These women and so many others prove that a woman who prays is unstoppable. She may be a mother interceding for her children, a wife covering her husband in prayer, or a single woman standing in the gap for her future. She may be a grandmother whose whispered prayers in the night sustain an entire generation. She may be a young girl seeking God's direction for her life. Regardless of who she is, where she is, or what she is facing, her prayers reach heaven, and God responds. The enemy fears praying woman because he knows that when she calls upon the name of the Lord, strongholds are broken, chains fall, and darkness is pushed back. She is not powerless, she is a warrior. Her prayers may not always bring immediate answers, but they always bring divine intervention. A woman who prays is never alone, for the God who fights her battles stands beside her, ready to move at the sound of her voice. God is the defender of those who put their trust in him. And this is especially true for the woman who prays. Life is full of battles, some seen, some unseen, but a woman who walks with God never has to fight alone. When she kneels in prayer, she is not standing in her own strength. She is calling upon the Almighty, the one who never loses a battle. He shields, protects, and fights for her even when she doesn't realize it. Throughout Scripture, God reveals himself as a defender of the weak, the forgotten, and the oppressed. He does not ignore the cries of his daughters. He is the God who sees, the God who hears, and the God who answers. When Hagar was cast out into the wilderness with her child abandoned and afraid, she thought she was alone, but God appeared to her and declared, I have heard the boy crying as he lies there. Genesis 21:17. He provided for her and made a way where there was none. That is the nature of God. He steps in when no one else will. When a woman prays, she activates the divine protection of God. The enemy may come against her, but he cannot prevail because the Lord stands between her. In the attack, Psalm 91 declares he will cover you with his feathers, and under his wings you will find refuge. His faithfulness will be your shield and rampart. A praying woman is not exposed, she is hidden in the shadow of the Almighty. Consider the story of Esther. She did not have an army, wealth, or influence in the natural, but she had something greater: faith in a God who defends his own. When the decree was made to destroy the Jewish people, she did not panic. She called for fasting and prayer. And what happened? The very gallows that were built for her people became the instrument of her enemy downfall. God fought for her not because she had power, but because she sought him in prayer. The same God who defended Esther defends every woman who turns to him. The battles of life can be overwhelming, whether they are struggles in the home, in health and finances, or in relationships, but no attack is greater than God's ability to protect. He does not promise that trials will never come, but he does promise that he will never leave nor forsake those who call upon him. The enemy knows he cannot defeat a woman covered by God's hand, so his strategy is to make her believe she is alone, but she is not. The Lord himself goes before her, stands beside her, and surrounds her with his presence. He is her refuge, her fortress, her strong tower. When she calls on him, he answers. When is weak, he strengthens her. And when she faces battles too great for her, he steps in and fights on her behalf. The woman who prays is never defenseless, because the God of heaven is her defender. Throughout Scripture, we see the power of a praying woman time and time again. Women who sought God in prayer witnessed his mighty hand move in their lives. Their stories serve as a testament to the fact that God hears the cries of his daughters and responds to their faith. These women were not always strong in their own ability, nor were they always in positions of power, but their prayers changed history, defied the odds, and brought about divine intervention. Hannah is one of the most powerful examples of a woman whose prayers touched heaven. She was barren, ridiculed, and heartbroken. Year after year, she endured the pain of watching others receive the very blessing she longed for: a child. But instead of allowing bitterness to take root, she turned her sorrow into prayer. She went before the Lord, weeping, pouring out her heart in desperation. She made a vow, promising to dedicate her child to God if he would grant her a son. And in response to her persistence and faith, God opened her womb. She gave birth to Samuel, a prophet who would anoint kings and lead Israel in righteousness. Hannah's story proves that prayer can turn mourning into joy and barrenness into fruitfulness. Another example is Esther, a woman who did not initially set out to be a hero, yet through prayer she became one. She was placed in a royal position, not knowing that she would one day have to intercede for her people's survival. When a decree was issued to destroy the Jews, she did not rush into action based on fear. Instead, she called for fasting and prayer. She understood that the battle was not merely physical but spiritual, and because of her prayers, God gave her wisdom, favor with the king, and the courage to intervene. The enemy's plans were overturned and an entire nation was saved. Esther's story reminds us that prayer can change the course of history and that God defends those who seek him. The Phoenician woman in the New Testament is another remarkable example of the power of a persistent praying woman. Her daughter was tormented by an unclean spirit, and although she was not an Israelite, she believed in the power of Jesus. When she approached him, she was met with resistance, yet she refused to be discouraged. She prayed boldly, pressing forward despite every obstacle. Jesus was moved by her unwavering faith and granted her request, delivering her daughter instantly. Her story teaches that even when it seems like the answer is delayed, persistence in prayer brings breakthrough. These women and many others in the Bible show that prayer is not limited by status, circumstances, or background. A praying woman does not need the approval of people. She needs only faith in the one who holds all things in his hands. Whether she is praying for her family, her community, or a nation, her prayers carry power. God listens, he responds, and through prayer, he does the impossible. There are moments in life when everything seems hopeless, when the weight of the world feels unbearable and the situation appears beyond human control. It is in these moments that prayer becomes the bridge Between impossibility and divine intervention, the world may say that some things cannot change, that certain situations are final, but God specializes in making the impossible possible. When a woman prays, she invites the supernatural power of God into her circumstances, and what seemed unchangeable begins to shift. In the Bible, there are countless examples of situations that appeared hopeless until prayer changed everything. Take Hannah, for instance. She was barren, mocked, and heartbroken year after year. She watched others receive what she desperately longed for, a child. She could have accepted her fate, but instead she took her pain to the Lord in prayer. She poured out her heart at the altar, not just with words, but with deep, desperate faith. And what happened? God heard her cry and opened her womb, giving her a son, Samuel, who became one of the greatest prophets in Israel's history. What seemed impossible became a testimony of God's faithfulness. Another powerful example is the widow of Zarephath. She had only a handful of flour and a little oil left, just enough to prepare a final meal for herself and her son before they would die of hunger. But in that moment of desperation, God sent the prophet Elijah to her, and through her obedience and faith, her supply never ran out. Every day, God provided enough for her to survive. What was supposed to be her end became a new beginning because she trusted in the Lord. Even in the New Testament, we see the power of prayer overcoming impossible situations. The woman with the issue of blood had suffered for 12 years, spending all she had on doctors who could not heal her. Society had cast her aside, labeling her as unclean, but she refused to give up. She believed that if she could just touch the hem of Jesus' garment, she would be healed. And in that moment of faith, power flowed from Jesus, and her suffering ended. What no physician could fix, prayer accomplished in an instant. There is no situation too broken for God to restore, no sickness too great for Him to heal, and no battle too difficult for Him to win. The enemy wants women to believe that their problems are beyond God's reach, that their prayers are ineffective, but that is a lie. A praying woman stands in the gap between despair and victory. She does not allow fear to dictate her future because she knows the one who holds it. God moves when His people pray, and nothing is beyond His ability to change. The mountain may seem immovable, but faith the size of a mustard seed can make it crumble. Prayer is the key that unlocks miracles, and when a woman refuses to give up, heaven responds. The possible is no match for a woman who prays. The enemy fears a praying woman because she is a direct threat to the kingdom of darkness. She does not fight with earthly weapons, but with the power of prayer, which is far more dangerous to Satan than anything else. A woman who prays cannot be easily deceived, discouraged, or defeated because she is connected to the source of all strength, God Himself. When she lifts her voice in faith, heaven moves, angels are dispatched, strongholds are broken, and the enemy's plans are destroyed from the very beginning. Satan has tried to silence women and keep them from their divine purpose. He deceived Eve in the garden because he understood the power of her influence. He knew that if he could separate her from God, he could weaken the generations to come. But what he did not anticipate was that God would use women throughout history to advance His kingdom in ways that would shake hell at itself. And a woman who prays is one of the greatest threats to His plans. The Bible gives us clear examples of how prayerful women disrupted the enemy's schemes. Consider Esther, a young Jewish woman who found herself in a position of influence in a foreign land. An evil decree had been issued to destroy her people, and the enemy wanted her to remain silent, but instead she turned to fasting and prayer, calling upon God for deliverance. Her prayers turned the situation around, and what was meant for destruction became a divine reversal. The enemy feared what she could accomplish through prayer, and his plans failed. Look at Hannah, a woman tormented by barrenness and mocked by her rival. The enemy wanted her to live in shame and despair, to believe that her situation would never change, but instead of sinking into bitterness, she took her pain to God in prayer, and because she refused to give up, God not only gave her a son, but a prophet who would anoint kings and change the course of Israel's history. The enemy wanted to silence her, but her prayers produced a victory that could not be undone even in the New Testament, we see how powerful a praying woman can be. The Syrophoenician woman came to Jesus pleading for her daughter to be delivered from demonic oppression. The enemy had bound her child, but the mother's persistent faith would not be denied. She prayed with boldness, refused to be turned away, and because of her unshakable faith, her daughter was set free. The enemy does everything he can to keep women from prayer because he knows the power it holds. He tries to distract them, discourage them, and make them feel unworthy. But when a woman refuses to be silenced, when she lifts her voice in prayer, the forces of darkness tremble. She is not fighting alone. She is backed by the power of heaven. A praying woman is dangerous to the enemy because her prayers unlock miracles, shift atmospheres, and bring the presence of God into every situation. Victory does not always come in an instant. Sometimes the breakthrough we long for requires persistence of faith that refuses to back down and a heart that continues to pray even when the answer is delayed. The enemy hopes that discouragement will cause believers to give up, but a woman who persists in prayer is unstoppable. She knows that just because she has not yet seen the answer does not mean God is not working. She understands that delays are not denials, and that God honors those who refuse to let go of his promises. Jesus himself taught about the power of persistent prayer in the parable of the persistent widow. Luke 18 verses 1 to 8. This woman was seeking justice from an unjust judge who neither feared God nor cared about people. At first the judge ignored her, but she refused to stop asking. She kept coming back, knocking on his door, pleading her case until he finally gave in, not because he cared, but because her persistence wore him down. Jesus used this parable to show that if even an unrighteous judge would respond to persistence, how much more will God, who is loving and just, answer his children who cry out to him day and night. Hannah is another example of persistence in prayer. She wanted a child, but year after year she remained barren. She could have accepted a situation and lived in silent sorrow, but she didn't. Instead, she poured out her heart to God, weeping in his presence, refusing to give up on the desire placed within her. Her persistence moved the heart of God, and in due time she conceived and gave birth to Samuel, one of Israel's greatest prophets. Another example is Elijah on Mount Carmel. Although he was a prophet, he did not just declare that rain would come after years of drought and then walk away. He prayed, and when he saw nothing, he prayed again 7 times. He sent his servant to look toward the sea, and only on the 7th time did a small cloud appear. That small sign was enough for Elijah to know that the rain was coming. The victory was won not just by prophecy, but through persistence and prayer. There are times when prayers seem to go unanswered and doubt begins to creep, and the enemy whispers, "Give up, it's not working." But victory belongs to those who refuse to stop praying. The walls of Jericho did not fall on the first day, but after days of obedience. Persistence. Naaman was not healed after dipping in the Jordan once, but after 7 times. The key to victory is perseverance. God honors faith that endures. He sees the woman who continues to pray for her family, the mother who intercedes for her children, the wife who covers her marriage in prayer, the believer who holds on despite unanswered prayers. The breakthrough always comes at the appointed time, and the woman who refuses to stop praying will see the victory God has prepared for her. A woman who praise is a woman who walks in victory. She is not defeated by the trials of life because she knows where her strength comes from. She understands that God is her defender, her refuge, and her source of power. When she faces the impossible, she does not surrender to fear. She presses in through prayer, believing that God will make a way where there is none. The enemy may try to silence her, to discourage her, and to make her feel powerless, but he trembles at the sound of her prayers because he knows that when she calls on the name of the Lord, heaven responds. History and scripture have shown that God moves when his daughters pray. He heard Hannah's cry and gave her a son. He saw Esther's fasting and prayer and saved a nation. He honored the Syrophoenician woman's faith and delivered her daughter. Time and time again, God has proven that he fights for the woman refuses to give up. She does not need to rely on her own strength because the battle belongs to the Lord. The victory is not always immediate, And the answers do not always come in the way she expects, but she trusts in the God who never fails, even in the waiting, even in the struggle. She knows that her prayers are not in vain. She stands firm, persistent in faith, knowing that the same God who parted the Red Sea, brought down the walls of Jericho, and raised the dead is the same God who hears her today. So let the woman who prays be encouraged. Her voice is heard in heaven. Her faith moves mountains. Her persistence breaks chains. Her prayers shake the kingdom of darkness, and no matter what comes against her, she is never alone, for the God who fights for her will always have the final word.